the amount of false stuff that Chat GPT and even deep research and whatever throws at me, I'm just like, I'm not going to hand the future of the planet over to these machines anytime soon. Like, that would be completely irresponsible. And yet, here's the Pentagon signing a huge deal with Grok.
Yeah.
And it's like, I know last week Grok was calling
thought it was
itself
Hitler last week.
and now it's like the Department of Defense is like, all right, sign me up.
Machine Hitler getting a military is no problem. Nothing to worry about there.
Right.
Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller. Delighted to have with me a science writer and essayist for the New York Times Opinion, a columnist for the New York Times Magazine. He also has a newsletter on climate, and he's the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, published in 2019, a very uplifting piece of literature. It's David Wallace-Wells. What's up, man?
Really good to be here. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. I guess I just want to start in the micro about the Texas floods, which is why one of the reasons I reached out to you recently, and then kind of get a little more macro on climate stuff after that. But as of last night, we have 132 dead from those floods, according to the Dallas Morning News, and another 100 missing, which is, I think, as you noted in your column about this, more dead than in the Maui fires. It does, and maybe it's because we were both on holiday recently, and I just kind of it feels like the scale of the reaction to this has been like kind of mild compared to the scale of the devastation. But I kind of want to just put a quarter in and give any thoughts you have on what we saw in Texas.
Well, just to start with what you mentioned, the scale of reaction, I think that's basically the standard now. I mean, I think a lot about the fires that swept through LA. That was just 6 months ago. It's like a huge, incredibly wealthy neighborhood in one of the most kind of globally, culturally relevant places in the entire world, full of lots of famous, well-connected, powerful people. The entire neighborhood was incinerated. And 6 months later, it's not like a major story about our climate, about our politics, about our society. Even when I talk to my friends in LA, it's like a third or fourth order concern for them. And you see the same thing as, the Maui fires that you mentioned from a couple of years ago, which, okay, it's a wildfire, it's a tragedy. It was the deadliest North American wildfire in more than a century. It destroyed the indigenous capital of the island. There still are, last year there were these shocking homelessness numbers. Homelessness went up more last year than it had in recent history. And there was some part of that coming out of the migrant surge and people, basically the way that filtered through the cities. But a big part of it was actually people displaced in Hawaii by the Lahaina fires. And so that's the scale of climate disaster that was. And again, it's just not getting traction. With the Texas floods, we had a pretty intense, 3 or 4 day news cycle. We're still seeing a fair amount of, soft focus, human interest coverage. And the stuff is just absolutely devastating. I mean, to think about these camp counselors leading these little girls through the floodwaters and people getting notes home from their camper kids who are now dead, getting their notes in the mail. I mean, it's just absolutely, kind of crippling, devastating. But we don't have the kind of, attention economy media ecosystem that makes these things really long stories anymore. And I think there's a really natural comparison to make between the Texas floods and Hurricane Katrina. And when I think about that example, I just think, it wasn't the only thing that killed George W. Bush's presidency. It wasn't the only thing that put the Republican Party's reputation in the toilet, but it was a meaningful contribution to what felt like a generational setback. And I don't think there's going to be anything like that kind of response to these floods, as there wasn't to Hurricane Helene, as there haven't been to so many of these disasters that we've seen, even though you can make a case that the FEMA response and the federal response in Texas and the way that the local authorities failed to prepare for such an event was, as terrible and ill-prepared as we saw in New Orleans around Katrina. So
I thought you were going to make the comparison to gun violence in Uvalde, right? That it's like this horrific tragedy that also happens in Texas. Obviously a big story for a little while, but no repercussion. It's a total failure of local officials, in addition to being this broad cultural failure, no repercussions for anybody politically at the local level.
In the Texas Hill Country, it's all of these stories we've seen over the last, week or 10 days, was known to be a meaningful risk. Climate change is intensifying that risk, making these kinds of extreme floods more likely. We can talk about that in a second. But it was known that there was real danger here, and yet very little was done to prepare. And in fact, the camp itself lobbied to be excluded from these FEMA requirements when they did repairs in recent years, a multi-million dollar. They didn't do anything to address the flood risk. And I think that tells you something complicated about the thing we're dealing with here when we talk about the risk from climate change, which is that, it's not neatly that we're going to be facing these unprecedented, unimaginable storms and natural disasters. So those will occasionally happen. Much more often, we're going to be dealing with more intense climate events that resemble events that we encountered in the past and which we have just utterly failed to prepare for. And climate skeptics will often talk about that and say, or, people who are climate complacent and say, well, we can manage these risks. In theory, we could have done more to prepare for these floods in Texas. And that is to some extent true. But we didn't, even with the knowledge that we had. And climate change is making the gap between, the adaptation levels that we'd want to be at and the adaptation levels that we are at larger rather than smaller. And that's a story that's playing out all around the world when it comes to climate risk, not just in Texas. But I think, because of the culture of Texas has especially a lot to answer for here.
Yeah. Living in New Orleans, I think about this a lot. I mean, we literally went through Katrina and there have been some huge changes to, prepare for the future, but also simultaneously, like we have pumps that don't work. If a regular rain falls and I'm like, how is this like not an urgent priority for the city of New Orleans, making sure the pumps work? And I mean, this is just a micro example where I live, but
totally. The major infrastructural response that we took in the aftermath of Katrina didn't even prepare the city for a Category 5 hurricane. So, and Katrina wasn't when it hit, but right. Obviously it should have told us that kind of thing was possible. And in planning, we should say, well, what is the worst case scenario? Let's prepare for that. And as you well know, also, it's not just the direct climate risks. I mean, New Orleans is a different city. It's a different economy. It's a different school system. Yeah. It's a different culture than it was before that storm. This can have really profound, what used to be called the kind of civilizational scale effects. Yeah, we're not doing nearly enough to prepare, adapt, to respond to the things even after they hit.
Yeah, so your column on this last week, I guess, was about how we can adapt and prepare for floods. And you wrote about how we're not all that adapted to the climate we have now. Forget the climate that's coming. Like, what are some examples of that? And are there places where people are doing it well? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think one lesson is that we've actually gotten up quite a bit better when it comes to hurricanes. People, we can track them really well. Our hurricane forecasting is much better, which means when people are told to evacuate, actually it's a much more targeted ask than it was even 15 or 20 years ago, because we have a much better sense of where the hurricane's going to land. People basically in hurricane zones do know to leave. Not everybody does. There are some people left behind. A lot of that has to do with, socioeconomic disparities. But in general, we have acculturated the idea of when a huge storm is coming, that is a real risk and you should get out of the way. And we saw that even in Hurricane Helene, when it hit the coast, and it was actually not that devastating on the coast. But then it continued inland, where we have not done nearly as much of that kind of cultural preparation. And it just absolutely walloped, Georgia, South Carolina, and especially Western North Carolina, which are not places that are used to dealing with these risks. And I think globally, we're seeing that phenomenon quite dramatically with all of these crazy flooding events, particularly in cities. I see videos from South America, from Europe all the time, which is streets in old cities just absolutely flooded, cars being pulled down by the floodwater, people being pulled away by the floodwater. And we're seeing that kind of episode more and more, not the hurricanes. And, in the last couple of years, actually, we haven't even had, there've just been kind of fewer of some of those classic coastal disasters. But the inland flooding is something that few people were even worrying about a few years ago. And now it seems almost like it's the protagonist of the climate crisis is disasters inland. I mentioned in that piece, the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, compiles this database of they call billion-dollar disasters. And there are a lot of issues with this database because it, as land gets more valuable, the same disaster will register a much bigger hit, et cetera. Nevertheless, they're just calculating how many disasters have caused more than $1 billion in damage, and the number is going up very dramatically. But even more striking than that, it's dominated by these like normal storms. It's not dominated by hurricanes. It's not even dominated by wildfires. It's dominated by just what they call extreme storm events. So all over the country in the US, you just have, oh, here's a big rainstorm hitting Iowa. Here's a big rainstorm hitting New Mexico. There was a huge flash flood in New Mexico last week too. Or in North Carolina, there was another one last week as well. And I just think off the coast, we've done far, far, far too little to prepare for these kind of floods. And I don't even think we really understand exactly why they're getting so intense. The science says they have this line that's like, for every degree of warming, you get 7% more water. And they also say that extremes get worse much faster than the median. But when I look at these storms, these 500-year storms, 1,000-year storms, so-called, they just seem to be happening so much more often and doing so much more damage. And I think there may be some remaining mystery about exactly why they're getting so intense. Certainly, we're not prepared for the intensity that they're bringing today.
Yeah. And maybe I'm missing it just because I'm consuming so much insane national politics news, but like it feels like it's less of a conversation than it was 10 years ago, right? Like, and this sort of how do cities adapt, right? Like as far as in the political kind of cultural, conversation is here's a big challenge we need to solve. And it's not like it's not happening, but it feels like it's been deprioritized. You're following this stuff closer to me. Is that a misimpression?
I think it's kind of complicated, but I would say that you have had a very representative experience, which is to say that like our politics has become much more nationalized, even over the course of the last 10 years. And that's true at the level of discourse, like who's saying what, who's focusing on what. It's also true at the level of funding. Like, it's just not the case that like, if Houston wants to build the Ike Dike, like they can't do that without federal money. Even New York, like, one of the richest places in the country, we can't build $100 billion storm barrier, which is like what FEMA is proposing we do, without federal money. And so, states in particular have these budget constraints. They can't do disaster response. They can't do large scale adaptation without federal funding. And yet we have, a system in which systematically local authorities have much less money to play with in spending, on this stuff. And as a result, I think people just don't focus on it as much. I do think there is some local adaptation going on.
Sure.
You do hear, especially in places like Phoenix, a lot of stuff about heat adaptation. And we'll see what happens with the insurance market coming out of the California wildfires. Still a huge, huge question, and how that all shakes out really will shape the future course of development in California and maybe even around the country, since the consequences for the insurance market are so large. But I would also just emphasize, adaptation is not just a public policy measure. It's also an individual response. People learn what to do and how to respond. Like in California, you get an alert, you get out of the house, when the fires come in. And that is not just even true at the level of behavior. It's also true at the level of biology. If you look at the way that, heat death affects people in really poor, hot countries, it actually takes a lot more to kill people there than it does in Europe, which actually has the highest level of heat vulnerability, because the people there are not used to high temperatures. They don't have air conditioning. They're a lot older than people in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. And so, we've told ourselves in the climate world a lot of scary stories about the intensity of heat effects, especially on the global south. But it may be the case that the sort of bullseye there is actually Europe. And that's in part because people's bodies, as they grow, learn how to deal with different climates and different effects. And we just haven't seen those kinds of extreme temperatures, certainly in Europe and in parts of the US too.
If you're like me, you wish you would have served a few NVIDIA shares before they boomed. It does seem nice. I was at a school function where one of the grandpas was talking to me about how much money he made on NVIDIA. Good for you, sir. But if you missed out like me, don't miss out on protecting your family's future. For around the same price per month as one of your streaming services, you can secure you and your family's future by finding life insurance at SelectQuote.com. If you're new to life insurance, you're not alone. Thankfully, I've found SelectQuote. For over 40 years, SelectQuote has helped more than 2 million Americans understand their options and get the coverage they need. Over $700 billion in coverage and counting. As a broker, their mission is simple: to find you the right insurance policy at the best price. SelectQuote takes the guesswork out of finding the right life insurance policy. You don't have to sort through dozens of confusing options on your own. Instead, one of their licensed agents will find the right policy at the right price for you, comparing plans from trusted, top-rated insurance companies to find a policy that fits your health, your lifestyle, and your budget. And they do it, and they work for you for free. And you're not out of luck if you have a pre-existing health condition, because SelectQuote partners with companies that offer policies for people with conditions like high blood pressure, diabetes, or heart disease. Life insurance is never cheaper than it is today. SelectQuote. They shop, you save. Get the right life insurance for you for less and save more than 50% at selectquote.com/bulwark. Save more than 50% on term life insurance at selectquote.com/bulwark today to get started. That's selectquote.com/bulwark. All right, so let's zoom out a little bit. Last time we talked, I basically asked you, I said, I want an uninhabitable Earth update, right? I think we talked in 2023 or 24. I'm going to TLDR you a little bit. It was basically, we aren't alarmed enough at a global level, but also warming projections have gotten better since you'd written the book.
Yeah.
So now, around a year and a half since then, update me.
Well, the big story that I would tell is that the momentum for global climate action that was building all through the 2010s kind of gave us the Paris Accord in 2015, and then to some extent this like rising tide of climate concern and alarm in 2019 and 2020 with things like Extinction Rebellion and Greta and the Green New Deal and the Green Deal in Europe. That now just feels like a relic of an impossibly distant era, and not just narrowly on climate action, although that's a big part of it. It's also just like, if you think about what the Paris Accords told us about the future, it was that we were heading towards an era of more global cooperation defined by increasing solidarity among the world's nations and a growing sense of mutual obligation and aid. And those are just not principles that are like present in the global stage anymore. And, you know,
so we don't care about each other anymore. So that's a big change in the last year. You know?
I mean, I think it's a huge story, especially coming out of the pandemic. I think many people who had a sense of real deep, you know, humanitarian solidarity in, say, 2018, 2019, 2020, by 2022, like having been pushed through the ringer of, you know, whatever was all the burdens and, you know, trauma of the pandemic, so many more people came out feeling like just much more mercenary in their view of the world. And that has filtered up through our politics in really profound ways. I don't know that it's all that dramatic in the end for climate, in part because one thing that's happened is that the US has just completely retreated. And that's given a huge opening to China, who is doing an awful lot to accelerate the green transition. So 75% of all renewable projects being built anywhere in the world right now are being built in China, or by Chinese companies elsewhere in the world. And, you know, they're maybe have reached a peak of carbon. We'll see how it shakes out. But like, in any event, they are building a massive clean energy electrostate. And the US is over here doubling down on fossil fuels, kneecapping renewables wherever they can. But the third part of the story is that because China's made so much of this stuff so cheap, it can now be sold to countries who people like you and me used to talk about as like, they can't afford the transition on their own.
Sure.
And like just a couple of years ago, there was this miraculous thing that happened in Pakistan where, you know, there was the issues with global coal systems because of the invasion of Ukraine. Europe bid up the price of coal. All this coal that was like literally on boats going to South Asia got redirected back up to Europe so they could use it. And there was in the global South a huge problem with like these rolling blackouts because electricity prices, fossil fuel prices were so high, and some of the supply, even though they accounted on, wasn't there. And the response to that was not even at the policy level in Pakistan. It was at the individual level. Just like tons of people just started buying these solar panels from China and putting them on their roofs. So much so that like they've now it's something like 40 or 50% of their energy mix. It comes from rooftop solar. And like, that's because a solar panel now costs less on the free global market, not in the United States where you can't buy it this way, but on the free global market, a solar panel costs less than the same amount of wood to build a fence. So like if you're putting up a fence in your yard, people are like,
really?
Why not? Yeah. Why not just build it out of solar panels?
I'm like leasing a solar panel on my house right now. I'm on like a 80-year lease that I'm paying. Some guy.
in the US, the story is really different. But yeah, I mean, you know, in Germany, they're like hanging them off their balconies. There's been this huge boom in balcony solar power, and it's like they're not even angling the solar panel towards the sun in the optimal way. But it's like, who cares? It's like if the material is actually cheaper than what I'd be doing otherwise, any power that I can get from it is a bonus. And there are now, according to think tanks and stuff, they say like, you know, this Pakistan boom that took everybody by surprise because it wasn't even directed by public policy, just by individuals who were desperate for energy. There are now maybe dozens of other countries that are poised to make the same jump that they did in the global south because of just how cheap things are. So we have this the era of global climate geopolitics has kind of ended, but the actual green transition is moving ahead maybe as fast, maybe even faster than we would have hoped it would have in the presence of politics. And, that's kind of mind-bending in certain ways. It's also depressing about the future place of America on the world stage, but it may, for the sake of climate, be ultimately at least a mixed bag and maybe even good news.
Yeah, I want to do more on the China thing, but just really quick, like the actual. So when we last talked, I think you said like in 2019, the projection, like the median projection was something like 4% warming. It had gone down to like 2.5%.
Yeah.
Something that like is that kind of still what the experts think? And this is not my wheelhouse.
That's basically where we are. Yeah, we're still somewhere in the zone of between 2 and 3 degrees. Not much has changed over the last couple of years, in part because there hasn't been much policy change, and a lot of that modeling is based on policy. But just to keep that in mind, like that's really good, right? Like we went from 4 to 5 to 2 to 3, huge progress. But like if you remember getting freaked out about climate change in 2019, as a lot of people were, that was because there was a huge scientific report about how bad 2 degrees was going to be. And we are going to get north of that. Like what freaked you out then, we're not avoiding it. We're going there. In fact, there have been some days that have already been above 2 degrees, although that's not what people mean when they say that we're at 2 degrees. Sure. They mean a 30-year average. So we are basically our progress, our models have like somewhat stalled out. We're still in a relatively better place than we were a few years ago, while still being north of what we defined not that long ago as catastrophe. There is this other little thing to mention, which is, a little scarier, which is that there's a growing concern that a lot of these models are just missing some basic fundamental aspects of the climate system. And there's been a sort of contrarian minority of climate scientists who think that we're heading already for a considerably faster warming. And in fact, warming has accelerated. It is now inarguably accelerated over the last couple of decades rather than slowing down. And there are a lot of possible reasons for that. But one basic thing is that we have cleaner air now. We've stopped polluting the oceans with these real sulfur belching ocean liners and tankers, and all that pollution that goes up into the atmosphere actually reflects sunlight and makes the planet cooler. It also affects the formation of clouds, which also have an effect here. And the net of all of that is that the impact of the carbon that we put into the atmosphere is actually more intense than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And, there's some pretty prominent people. Again, I wouldn't say it's like exactly the conventional wisdom or the establishment view, but there's some quite prominent, quite pedigreed people who think that even if the sort of conventional wisdom model says, let's say 2.5 degrees is where we're heading, they think we're actually still on track for 4 or 5, even though we've cut our emissions below what we thought was necessary to get us to 4 or 5, because it turns out.
Can we pollute without putting out emissions? Are there other kind of pollutants we can put?
Well, I mean, you've heard of geoengineering, right? Yeah. That's what that is. That's like
they just made that illegal in Florida. So,
instead, the basic idea is like, we breathe in all this shit, we get sick, we suffer as a result. Something like 10 million people a year are dying from air pollution, and it has this climate benefit, which is it cools the planet somewhat. And the geoengineering pitch is, let's just put that stuff higher in the atmosphere so we don't have to breathe it into our lungs. It doesn't affect our health, and we can cool the planet that way. And there are huge questions about whether that's safe or too risky, but it does feel like we're moving in a direction where more and more people are kind of taking that possibility seriously. And maybe it'll end up being the cure-all that the optimists think it is. I'm suspicious, I'm skeptical, but
I just, like a lot of people, I read The Deluge, which is a fiction, but that's kind of fiction after the LA fires. And it's like the contrarian scientist telling everybody that it's going to get worse is hitting a little close to reality there with that,
I mean, the LA fires, I don't know if have you looked at like Zillow for Pacific Palisades recently? It is like,
no,
it's like every lot is for sale Every lot is priced north of $5 million, and the vast majority of them are just rubble.
Wild.
And it's like, I think the city has approved something like 8 licenses to rebuild. So that whole neighborhood is still just completely destroyed. And a lot of those homeowners, even quite rich ones, are going to just like, I mean, putting aside the fact that they saw their homes burn, and they breathed in air that was like full of bicycles and HVAC systems and cars that had been incinerated by the fires. They have like a $10 million home, and they're going to get a much smaller amount of payout from that. So we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, now I have a friend that lived in Pacific Palisades. Now I'm guilty. I haven't checked in with them in a couple months. So now you're making me feel bad. I'm gonna have to text.
And there's this whole debate about it, which is related to the Texas flood stuff, which is, and I wrote some of this too right after the fires, which is like, we got to do a lot more. Forget, climate change is real. It's making these things worse, but we have to do a lot more to protect ourselves from threats like these. But the longer I've gone on, and the deeper I've looked into the exact nature of the particular fire in LA, I wonder just how much could be done, because Palisades already had building codes that required people to keep flammable plants away from their homes. They already had building codes about what you were allowed to build with and not. Most people weren't respecting them, but those codes were still there. And when you see, as that fire,
that comes back to the individual adaptation, though.
Totally. Yeah. And then at the social level, people talk about, we got to take care of the forests. We have to manage the, thin the forest, do prescriptive fire and all that stuff. And that's good at the level of the American West, even at the level of the state of California. But in California, in LA proper, like those hills where the fire started, those are not forests. That's brush. That stuff comes back. As soon as there's rain, there's new brush. And then as soon as there's a hot day, it's dry tinder. And there's just not all that much you can do. You can do a little bit, but there's not all that much to protect yourself there. And then when you have 60, 80, 100 mile an hour winds, it's like, so you have a building code that says you can't have a flammable plant within 10 feet of your house. Is that going to stop you from fire traveling at you at 100 miles an hour? Just seems, I mean, just to be clear, experts do say it would make a difference.
Sure.
But I sort of wonder, like, whether we're learning something fundamental about what can be built and defended in an environment like that, like that environment. And we may be learning that a lot less could be done and protected than we hoped.
This is kind of vaguely related to what I wanted to get back into on the China side. It is, your 75% stat is just remarkable. Kind of the electric car space too, and that, but first, that relationship between that and politics and influence, it is just insane to me that the most influential advisor to the president for the first 6 months was the owner of an electric car company. And as you mentioned, the people that have been victims of the recent climate events are ostensibly influential. We ought to talk about money in politics, rich people in California, rich people in Texas. And yet there's no attempt to try to compete, right? That is, narrative is barely even out there. Oh, we need to compete with the Chinese, we need to be better about this. The impact is coming for us. That is the part that is the craziest. If I would have flown 10 years ago and said, David, Elon Musk is the most influential advisor to the president, you'd have been like, oh, okay, well, we're finally getting serious about the green tech revolution in the White House. And instead, he was worried about trans boxers.
The most perverse part of this is, I think, that basically, if you look at the geopolitical game that's been played, or the geoeconomic game that's been played over the last half decade, it's that China has really profoundly bet on green tech, clean energy. And the US has really bet its economy on AI. And maybe on some level, that's a better bet. I'm kind of agnostic about it, on the side of skeptic, but maybe that's a better bet. But not only is our lead on AI not growing, it's shrinking, but we need energy for the AI that we are building. And we are, rather than pursuing an aggressive build out of the cheapest and fastest energy that we have, which is solar and to some extent wind, which, people talk about nuclear. It's it takes 30 years to build a nuclear plant. You can roll out huge, large scale solar much more quickly. We have permitting issues, but nevertheless, much faster than for nuclear, or for geothermal, which, again, I'm pro nuclear, I'm pro geothermal, but it's if you want to rapidly build out our electricity.
Permian Basin, we got more natural. Can we get more natural gas out of the Permian Basin?
My understanding is that, the basic dynamic there is that it's kind of diminishing returns. There's more that we can pull out of it, but it's not going to get cheaper. It's going to get more
Yeah.
expensive and more complicated. And that really, like, the simplest solution to our growing energy needs, which is to say the economically vital input that we need to make a bet on AI work out, is to deploy basically solar power at much more rapid scale. And when you look at what China's done there, they are just annihilating us. I mean, absolutely annihilating us. And we are not only, under Trump, we are not only emphasizing fossil build out, which, that's basically the energy policy. We're also like kneecapping the renewable progress that is possible. So it's, they want to sell it as energy abundance or energy dominance, but it's not. It's just fossil dominance that they're going for. And that means that, the main thing that could really make our sort of our energy demands for AI workable over the next 5 years, we're just like not even touching. And so it's just another sign that like with tariffs, we are reducing everything, even what seems like economically vital considerations, to culture war dynamics. And that's just totally catastrophic.
I have a million follow-up questions on this. So just on the AI part first, I don't like the thing that's been hard for me to, translate is like it's almost been memeified now on the left. They're like, oh, you shouldn't, create an AI image because you just, killed a tree or like hurt the climate or whatever. Like how much of like climate, energy expense risk is there with AI versus like the other side, right? Like if we were listening to the All In podcast right now, we'll steel man their side. Like David Sachs would be saying, well, AI will maybe solve the climate problem because we'll create such smart supercomputers that they'll figure out how to geoengineer things in the air.
Yeah.
And it's worth it. Like where do the smart people that you talk to fall in like that conversation?
Well, there are a lot of different things in that question, right? So just on the energy use, it's like, I think I would say that the carbon footprint of use of like ChatGPT has been overstated. Like when I put in a query, I'm not doing meaningful damage compared to everything else that I do as a modern American living in the 2025. It's not a dramatic, it's not like getting on a plane.
Flying to Europe was worse.
Totally. Way worse. The training runs are more significant. They take up much more energy. And I think the story I would tell there is
training the models, you mean?
Yeah.
The companies themselves training.
Yeah. And when you look at the big tech companies, like 5 years ago, they were like at the vanguard of being clean tech because they were like, all we need is electricity and we could just use green energy. It's like, we're going to be net zero by 2030. They made all these promises about how they were going to cut their emissions very dramatically. It was quite encouraging. A lot of them have like actually tried to do some amount of carbon removal stuff. But even just putting that aside, they were doing much better than the rest of the American economy at getting carbon out of their electricity systems. And that just stopped like 3 years ago. And they've all gone into reverse. And none of them are anywhere near the targets that they set for themselves in 2025 because of the energy demands of AI and trying to, meet those energy demands given the mix of the system that we have in the US today, which has a fair amount of clean energy in it, but is also a lot of fossil. If you project that out a decade or two down the line, you could plausibly tell yourself, well, if we get to a net zero electricity system, we don't need to worry all that much about how much we're using because none of it is affecting the future climate of the planet. And that's true of everything. It's like if we have, carbon-free jet fuel, we don't have to worry about flying to Europe. That's like the optimistic case for all of this is like we can get to some point where we don't have to worry about our guilt on any of these points. And that was technically like Joe Biden's clean electricity plan was to get us there. And we're now not on that path. And that means that for the foreseeable future, especially in the US, we're going to be dealing with some amount of feeling of guilt and responsibility for what we do with AI. Now, what can this tech do for us in the future? I mean, AI has already done an enormous amount for climate science, for clean energy. I think we often get a little confused because we talk about like AI as though it came out with ChatGPT in 2022 or whatever. And it's like scientists have been doing machine learning stuff for decades. And that's a big part of the whole scientific research apparatus. It's a big part of climate science. It's a big part of, energy innovation. Like, when we talk about managing the grid better, a lot of that has to do with, something you could call AI, even though it's not being done by a chatbot. And I do think that there's enormous potential there in the same way that there's enormous potential for AI with medicine and drug discovery and development. I think it's undeniable. Like the more firepower we have to throw at a problem, like the easier it'll be to solve. I'm somewhat more skeptical on the like LLMs are going to do all this stuff for us.
Right.
And honestly, I'm a little bit out of my depth talking about it in detail. But when in my personal use, like the amount of bullshit and you know false stuff that Chat GPT and even deep research and whatever throws at me, I'm just like, I'm not going to hand the future of the planet over to these machines anytime soon. Like, that would be completely irresponsible. And yet here we have here's the Pentagon signing a huge $200 billion deal with Grok.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Yeah.
I know last week Grok was
Grok
calling
thought it was
itself,
Hitler last week.
and there it's like the Department of Defense is like, all right, sign me up.
Machine Hitler getting a military is no problem. Nothing to worry about
Yeah,
there.
right. Yeah, no, it's like that old Norm Macdonald routine about Germany taking over the world again.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this is TBD. If I think it's possible in 50 years that we think that AI has really helped us address a lot of aspects of climate planning, climate resilience. I think that's certainly possible, but I don't think it's going to be coming out of a chatbot. I think it's going to be coming out of more constrained, more focused models.
What does feeling safe at home mean to you? For a long time, I thought it was enough to have locks and maybe an alarm that would make a lot of noise if someone actually broke in. But after I've had a few close calls myself, I realized that true security takes more, a system that works to prevent that break-in, that violation of your space from ever happening in the first place. That's why I trust SimpliSafe to protect my home and family. It's about security that is proactive, not just reactive. I said close calls because, back when we were living in Oakland, we had a gunfight in the street. Oakland living. Where like a bullet just came in, just like very tiny little bit into the house, which is, that's a little scary. And here in New Orleans, we're feeling safer. The only thing I've had is one of you guys show up to my house, which I didn't, which is nice. I love you all. I love seeing you all, but like maybe at the airport or the restaurant or something instead. And so, turning to SimpliSafe makes a lot of sense. Most security systems only take action after someone breaks in. That's too late. SimpliSafe's new Active Guard outdoor protection helps stop break-ins before they happen. AI-powered cameras and live monitoring agents detect suspicious activity around your house. No contracts, no hidden fees. It's named the best home security system of 2025. Over 4 million Americans trust SimpliSafe, ranked number 1 in customer service by Newsweek and USA Today. So visit simplisafe.com/thebulwark to claim 50% off a new system with a professional monitoring plan and get your first month free. That's simplisafe.com/thebulwark. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. Back to China. Just like the degree to which China is dominating us in this is something that like really has come into my vision in the past like 6 months. I mean, obviously this has been a little bit of a long time coming, but we're also compounding it right now. Like, just a couple of stories that just, the BYD, the electric car company has like a 5-minute charge car that's coming. So, which could put, totally change the game in that space, completely dominate Tesla. There are Chinese electric car dealerships in downtown Amsterdam. I'm walking around last week, right? So, we're losing there in the consumer space. And then the cancellations of the investments we were making, over the past 6 months. Like, so when you combine those two things, right? Like the Chinese advancements with the fact that I think we've closed like $8 billion worth of projects, that the government was going to be subsidizing here in the country, thanks to Elon and Doge and rescissions. So just to, talk about kind of like that, like the trajectory that the Chinese are on versus where we are.
Well, I mean, I would say, there's an awful lot of blame and responsibility to lay at the feet of Donald Trump and the Republican Party and Doge and all that. But it's actually a bigger story than that, because even despite Joe Biden making a huge push on climate, making the IRA his signature piece of domestic legislation, the US was still falling dramatically behind in those years. And one way that I like to tell that story is like, we basically had these subsidies in the IRA, and those subsidies were calculated to allow American producers to match the Chinese market. It was basically like, this is how much subsidy we have to give in order to make our domestic green economy competitive. And then like 9 months after the bill passed, Joe Biden's putting significant tariffs on top of that against Chinese green tech. And the reason he's doing that is because, oh, our calculation was actually way off. We have to like the gap is like
Yeah.
twice as big as we thought, and we need to fill that gap with something else. And then, it's like a few months after that, I see an essay by Brian Deese, who is, one of Biden's central economic advisors, but has a clean energy background and so really focused on these things. And he's like, we actually need America to subsidize the rest of the world buying our stuff from our clean stuff from us, like a green Marshall Plan, in order to compete with China. And that's basically it's an acknowledgement that even with the tariffs, we're still not catching up. People in South America and Africa are still going to be buying directly from the Chinese. We need to be, subsidizing it on top of that. So every few months we take a new assessment and we're even further behind. That even is before Donald Trump comes into office and basically cancels
and
the
their
IRA.
optimistic assessments about like how much it was going to cost to build and support this stuff, like all of that, and everything ends up becoming more expensive and less efficient than they thought.
And we think about it in terms. And we think about it in terms of cars. And I mean, a lot of very smart people think that basically the Chinese car industry is going to destroy the European car industry in a very short order. The US may hang on a little bit longer just because we have such a much larger domestic market. But we also think about it a little bit in solar panels, but it's also, it's batteries in general. It's like all of these inputs to all these things. It's the refining of rare earths. It's the pieces of solar panels. So even if you're a manufacturer in South Asia or Southeast Asia, you're still buying the raw stuff from China. They're just dominating every aspect of the green supply chain globally. Something like every single input is like 60, 70, 80% controlled by the Chinese. And when you get up to finished solar panels, it's even larger than that. So the US is just, hopelessly behind. And I think there's a way of thinking about this as just, this is the great story of our time. It's bigger than climate, but it's expressed in climate. It is a giant industrial superpower waking up. We thought that like the story of modernity was a Western story, but we may be learning that in fact we're handing the baton to China. That's not to say that like they're going to become, in geopolitical terms or military terms, the dominant power in short order. Who knows exactly how that'll all play out? But just when you think about what the global market is, what people trading in goods, where they are focused, where they're drawing from, it's like China is just building stuff out at such a different scale than anywhere else in the world. And it's just humbling because even 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we really thought we were in a dominant position here. When Obama was trying to pivot to Asia and do the TPP, he was like, I can keep China in this little box if I get people to sign on to this deal. And now we're just in a world where like much of the world is just like, forget the US, just forget them.
Yeah. The thing I think about listening to you just as sort of like the domestic political challenge and dealing with all this is it's kind of interesting that there isn't like, if I said, who is the politician or political figure or leader outside of politics who best represents like almost like a jingoistic or patriotic, flag waving, like we need to, like the US needs to compete and win around the world. Like we need to kick the Chinese ass. It's important that we do this for economically and geopolitically, Hulk Hogan, like we've got to go, dominate in this space. It's hard to that person doesn't exist really. And I do wonder if that if kind of the failure of the IRA is maybe related to that at all. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on either of those?
There is like that in like the Ezra and Derek abundance spirit, like that is sort of like their vision is like.
It's hard to think of Ezra as like a Hulk Hogan type figure, though.
Totally. Well, but they have they have a lot of friends sort of in various places on the political spectrum. Some of whom are a little bit more jingoistic. Mark Andreessen would certainly I think of him as in many ways a villain, but
now we're tipping over from jingoism into kind of like I'm a little bit interested
fascism?
in white identity politics and fascism, right? So we're trying to find someone else on that spectrum.
But it is interesting because a big pitch by or for the tech right in the run up to the November election was like, we need unencumbered development of these key industries, centrally AI, but also everything that serves AI.
Crypto.
We need to get all the regulation that Biden piled on us, which I think has been hugely overstated by these people, but I'm just ventriloquizing their point of view. We need to get all of that red tape cut. We need to get some more money flowing in from the government, but basically we need a hands-off approach to let Silicon Valley take over the future on behalf of the United States. And you hear that not just people talking narrowly about AI, but like all of the Palantir, Anduril folks, like they are like, we need to do this for military tech. We need to design, what's the name of the Alex Karp book? The Technological Republic or whatever.
Right.
Although he's not really imagining a republic at all. He's imagining something much more authoritarian than that. But in any event, there was this huge energy coming out of Silicon Valley that actually was doing exactly what you were saying, but it was aligned to the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And why was that? It was because like those people felt insulted by cultural signals coming out of like the Democratic Party under the Biden administration. I mean, there was Lena Khan doing some antitrust stuff, but like, these people, they just seem so insane to me. They talk about
because they weren't invited to the White House or whatever.
It's like, you guys all made hundreds of billions of dollars. You are the richest, most powerful people in the world. What are you complaining about? What kind, what treatment did you expect? And this is not new among business people.
No.
But
I
it seems
Cuban
so
about
grotesque.
this, and Cuban was like, "It's rational to me. It's like they didn't get their phone calls returned." And I'm like, "Okay." So I was like, "I didn't have a prom date either. I haven't turned to fascism." But I hear you. But again, though, maybe a narrative, I guess. If we're going to give a more not generous, a critique of the Democrats that's like more rational, right? Is it because they didn't offer, something that felt like a narrative framework that felt like it was about, whatever, like economic growth and prosperity for people, and that you could like we can solve that, we can solve these big problems, and we can do it with private sector, right? Like I don't know.
I mean, my view, I'm more on the left than you, but my view is like, that is the Green New Deal. Like that pitch was like, we're going to.
Yeah, there are a lot of dumb rules in the Green New Deal, though.
Well, I mean, we never got to a real policy proposal for it, right? So like,
there are a lot of dumb rules and things that random people put on white websites,
Yeah. I mean, and there are pieces of the climate coalition and the liberal left coalition that
are degrowth.
That have that impulse in them. But at its basic level, what it is like, do you remember the New Deal? We're going to do that for clean tech. We're going to spend a lot of money to build out a new infrastructure that will allow us to live cleaner, safer, like, more prosperous lives. We're going to invest through public means in the public well-being of the country and the planet. That's the basic conceit there, that a new industrialization could be brought about by climate concerns. And that is what we're seeing in China. And we turned away from it. Now, as both of us are saying, the Green New Deal was for many reasons a hard sell. It was not presented always in that way. But even when I think about what Joe Biden actually did accomplish with CHIPS and the infrastructure bill and the IRA, I mean, these are basically large-scale public spending programs to try to bring about a new era of economic prosperity. And all of them had clean aspects to them. But it's like, he's just basically saying, here's a tax credit to buy an EV. Here's a tax credit to buy solar panels. It's like, it wasn't oppressive. It was all carrot, no stick. And I think that helps explain why there was no broad public backlash to it. It was hardly mentioned on the campaign trail. It certainly wasn't mentioned in the midterms. And, you take
there's no backlash, but there's also no rallying around it. Right?
Yeah,
like nobody, there's no backlash, but also nobody seems too mad. No, like I'm mad. Like people are mad, but like there's no mass movement of anger about the fact that it's being taken away either.
No,
right?
I mean, I think a lot of folks, including folks who were involved in the writing of the IRA, are saying like this is not just a catastrophic setback for climate or for the American economy. It undermines our whole theory of politics. Like we thought we were going to send money to purple districts in purple states, and that was going to win people over to the cause of climate. And at the local level, it has done some of that. If you look at what's happened in Texas, where they've had, their electricity bills have been lowered by 50% by green energy build out, and they've had their risk of blackouts cut from like 16% to 1% just based on the new clean energy that they brought online in the last couple of years. Every year now, there are Texas legislators who try to undermine that program in the Texas State House, and every year they get defeated. But at the national level, we've just got which goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation. There's just so much other stuff that we're talking about that crowds up our mind, that even if people in Georgia or Texas are a little bit more supportive of green energy than they were 5 years ago, it doesn't ultimately matter for their presidential vote. And it's not the main way that they think about what's happening in Washington.
Yeah. The other thing, I don't think this is the Democrats' fault or less fault really, but like it getting coded left, also is just part of this. Like it gets lumped into climate, ends up getting lumped into the omni cause of all the other things that people think that they don't like about the left, right? And so you got into this situation where these fucking tech assholes, who are pushing for this, as you mentioned, this like revolution and this, investment and, getting rid of any government shackles and the expansion of AI and crypto. Like they didn't include green tech in part of it because it felt like, oh, like that's lib shit, right? Like, and that is maybe associated with polarization or maybe the disinformation, right? Like this might be tied into disinformation story where they've like decided that they don't think climate change is real anymore. You can't be a real conservative if you care about this. I don't know.
It sort of depends who you're talking about and how you slice the coalition. I mean, I've noticed certainly since Elon and Trump had a falling out that Elon has like routinely been posting about how much China's kicking our ass on green electricity and solar and that kind of thing. And you do hear that from a lot of people who are like in and around the tech right. They do talk about the need to build an electrostate, the need to build a type 1 civilization, they call it. Like they do use that language. And what that means
these nerds.
Yeah, well, it's just like they want to live in a sci-fi novel. I remember, I a bunch of years ago, I did a long interview. I did the Paris Review interview with William Gibson, and he was talking about how he sort of kind of came up with the idea of cyberspace, which is like, he said, I walked past a bus stop and I saw like an ad for a personal computer, and I was like, wow, that's really cool. And then I walked past an arcade and I saw all the kids leaning into the machine, and he was like, they want to live in the machine. They want to live inside the machine. All these people designing the future of the world in Silicon Valley, they all want to live in sci-fi and fantasy novels, and their understanding of the future is so defined in those terms. Nevertheless, they will often talk about the need for clean energy. They'll also talk about nuclear. They'll also talk about geothermal, but like they're not opposed to solar. But like the main thing they need is just volume of electricity. I do think that we're seeing in this period of the Trump, it's so hard to talk about the way this coalition is breaking up, and the Epstein thing is like one other chapter in that. But in this particular period where you have some, led by Elon, some frustration with, Trump in the way that the BBB went through, I think you are starting to see some concern from the tech titans about how underserved or poorly served their needs were and are by a fossil only approach. But it hasn't yet shatter the coalition at a national level by any stretch of the imagination.
Maybe that's why I feel so disconnected from this debate sometimes, because like you're right, like the tech guys do want to live in a machine, and you listen to the Peter Thiel interview, and like you can tell he kind of wants the human race to end, and that he wants us to become cyborgs. And then you've got and then he sees his enemy. He thinks Greta's the Antichrist. I don't think Greta's the Antichrist. But I think if anybody in the conversation is the Antichrist, it's probably Peter. But I don't think I don't believe there is an Antichrist. But I don't think Greta is the Antichrist. But I also like there's like a kind of a dehumanizing element sometimes to the conversation coming from the climate left too, right? That it's like we need fewer humans, we need less, less of that, right? And so I'm like these two people are fighting for each other, and I'm like, I don't think any of them actually really care that deeply about like human prosperity and in the future at a deep level.
I have more sympathy for the folks on the climate far left, I think, than you do. But
I wasn't trying to create a even parallel. I just mean that like this idea of of not centralizing individual human flollowing, versus caring more about others.
And when I started writing about climate, this is one of the things that I really leaned into and leaned on was I would say like I'm a New Yorker. I'm in a lot of ways like a neoliberal. I do not come to this because I care about polar bears or, forests or trees. I care about this because I started to realize how significant the impacts would be on humans and indeed on humans like me. But, the interesting thing to me about the questions that you're raising is that like everybody in talking about the American failure here points to China and says like, look how much they're doing. And whether it's like, Mark Andreessen lamenting how quickly they're building out their drone industry, or whether it's, Adam Tooze talking about like the rapid build out of solar, everybody's like, this is the country that's really building the future. And, there are huge problems with China politically in terms of, concern for individuals,
individual human flourishing is not actually a huge priority for Chairman Xi either.
But like, this is an illustration of how climate concerns can fuel radical transformation, at least in the context of a still growing, relatively young industrial economy. And I think that should make us all think a little bit harder about the whatever simplistic stories we might tell about what works and what doesn't, because, you're just like, it's just any claim that you make that is based on America or Europe doing it right or wrong is just obliterated by the example of China. Like nothing that we are doing in any direction almost has any bearing on, debates about what the correct approach about climate is, because China's just doing so much more of it. And, exactly what we can learn from them, I don't know. It may be limited, but, I don't think I don't know. I don't think we should just go around name calling about the people who are undermining it domestically. We have to think much bigger if we really hope to move into another safer, more habitable phase.
David Wallace-Wells trying to turn me red, and I think this is going to be the first Bulwark podcast to go viral on TikTok. The Chinese are like, okay, now they're finally making some sense over there at the Bulwark. They'll put their finger on the algorithm there. All right, you mentioned Epstein. You have an Epstein article out yesterday. I want to just talk about that briefly. We're going to obviously talk about Jeffrey Epstein on every episode for the foreseeable future until we figure out who killed him. And your headline is the Epstein story is both conspiracy theory and genuine scandal. What part's the scandal for you?
That so many of the world's most powerful people were associating, some in pretty ongoing, regular ways, with a notorious sex offender, even in a period of time when the culture was really hostile to the idea of, male sexual predation. So you have, especially after 2015, when a lot of extra stuff came out, but even going back to his first arrest, when people knew that he had been soliciting dozens of underage prostitutes and, you still have a huge cast of incredibly influential power brokers who were really, really close to Epstein. And I don't think we have any good explanation for that. The sort of most naive answer is that he was at least seen to be an extremely wealthy, powerful person in part because he had all of these connections, and he was able to convene other wealthy and powerful people in part because they were happy to be in his company in a kind of a private space and, talk with each other as though they were real people. That is to some extent defensible, but it's like if I'm imagining myself, I'm Larry Summers, I'm Kathy Rumler, I'm Bill Burns, I'm Nathan Myhrvold, I'm Bill Gates, I'm Reid Hoffman, I'm Peter Thiel, I'm any of these people, Ehud Barak, Prince Andrew, Mohammed bin Salman, any of these people who we have at least pretty good reason to believe had some ongoing relationships with him. I'm like, in 2015, 2016, 2017, am I really going to say it's okay to go to his house for dinner? Why is that somebody who I'm going to be associating with? And
they'd known for 10 years at that point.
Yeah. And, and so what are they getting out of it? What is the nature of that relationship? I actually don't have a especially paranoid view of it. I don't think, we'll see, or maybe we won't see it. Probably, actually, we won't see. But I'm sort of disinclined to believe that he was essentially running a pedophilia sex ring blackmail operation. I think that's quite extreme. My understanding of at least what his life in New York was that there wasn't much sort of sex in it involved. A lot of that was really focused in Florida, where he was sort of in some ways living separate lives. But nevertheless, just why are all these people here? Risking public condemnation for what? And there are these more fundamental questions, like how did he get the money that he seemed to have? How did he come into possession of the largest house in all of Manhattan? How did he become apparently a billionaire? All these things. What is the nature of his relationship, if any, with various intelligence services, etc. But I think the big scandal is we just have and still have an American elite, a global elite that counted him as a confidant and associate, and just doesn't seem to add up to me. And I don't think, a lot of the conspiracy stuff feels really extreme. This isn't QAnon. It's not, Pizzagate. I'm still why is Steve Bannon spending 15 hours talking to Jeffrey Epstein on camera? What the fuck is that about?
Yeah.
And then to see him last weekend on stage being we need a special investigator, a special counsel investigating this. It's you were a good friend of his.
Shouldn't you have been in on the investigation?
Or at least release the videotapes.
Release the videotapes, Steve Bannon. You release the tapes. Yeah. Here's the thing that people in that world, whatever you want to call it, the kind of contrarian, more conspiratorial, right world, the Rogan world. Here's the thing that I just would go a step further from what you're saying about what the scandal is, which is we know all of these people were involved with him at some level. We know at least some of them were involved with him with regards to the sexual predation of young girls. And there's been no social penalty or no legal repercussions
Yeah.
for anyone associated with Jeffrey Epstein besides Ghislaine Maxwell. Not a single person. Like, one of them became elected president and is the current president since then, with a long-time relationship with him. As you mentioned in your article, one of them was a past president, still is speaking at the Democratic National Convention last year. I'm not saying that there should be a specific social penalty for any of these people, but the fact that there's been none, and there's been no legal penalty, and that the first time Jeffrey Epstein got caught, he got a sweetheart deal. It is not illegitimate for regular people around the world to be like, this is rich fucking elite people protecting each other. Like, this is maybe Jeffrey Epstein wasn't running a blackmail racket, but there's a protection racket of some kind happening around all these folks.
Yeah,
and that is a real scandal, and that's a legitimate thing for people to be upset about. And clearly, Donald Trump was involved in that, and he's the current president of the United States.
It's elite impunity showcased in a very direct way in an era when that has been one of the things that the public has been most outraged about. I don't want to speak too much in defense of Donald Trump, but it does seem like they had, their falling out was in like 2004, 2005. So
that is true. His falling out was before he was first arrested. That is true.
According to Michael Wolff, according to Michael Wolff, that falling out happened in part because, according to Michael Wolff, Jeffrey Epstein thinks that Donald Trump turned him in out of, to punish or to prevent Epstein from dropping a dime on Trump for doing money laundering in Florida. So there is it is all like tangled up. I don't know exactly how seriously to take that story, but yeah, I would say more broadly, that plea agreement that Epstein signed in Florida in 2008, I think, explicitly, barred the federal government from prosecuting anyone related to the case in the future. And that is even more than the sort of short prison sentence, which he was mostly able to serve in his mansion. That part of the plea deal just seems a little curious, and I think hasn't ever really been adequately explained. And even beyond that, I think, putting aside the legal repercussions, I think actually I'm maybe a little bit more skeptical than you are that there are many other people who are involved in the sex crimes here. There may be some, but I'm sort of, myself.
Well, obviously there were people committing the sex crimes. It wasn't just Jeffrey Epstein that was fucking the girls.
Well, I don't.
You think it was?
I don't think we can say that for sure. The main accuser who
several of the accusers have accused other people, including Prince Andrew and others.
Yeah, I don't want to get into a position where I'm defending.
I don't want to make it defend. I'm just trying to understand. Go ahead.
Well, a lot of these people have questions about their credibility that are meant that they have not been called in any of the proceedings going forward. I think one of them actually made a public apology to Alan Dershowitz for accusing him. I have no sympathy for Alan Dershowitz, but just to say, a lot of this I would say is in the realm of ambiguity rather than known fact.
I sat with Alan Dershowitz at a dinner, one of these dumb dinners, where he talked about this for like 40 minutes and defending himself, which, like, on the one hand makes you feel like, man, a hit dog barks loudest. On the other hand, it's like, I don't know, if I was falsely accused of pedophilia in the news, like, maybe I would not be able to talk about anything else either. I don't know which way you fall on that, but it was noteworthy.
But to get back to my point, which is more about this sort of the culture of elite impunity in general, and it's more about the social approbation that you're talking about than the legal consequences, which is like, this was a public fact that Jeffrey Epstein was a sex trafficker and sex offender. That was known. It was known to me, as a reader of Gawker. Like, it was known to me. It was like, as readers of the New York Post, it was known to readers of the New York Post. It was a public fact. And that anybody would say, just a little peccadillo. I can just go over to dinner at his house. It's all fine. He doesn't, maybe he's being scapegoated. Maybe he's being, and the fact that anyone,
we'll let him sponsor our charity ball. Let him sponsor our university.
The Harvard and MIT connections are really quite astounding. And I think, it's just like, how could anybody, putting aside those who are directly associating with him, how could deans and provosts be like looking at like where this money is coming from and think, oh, that's fine. It's coming from a acknowledged sex trafficker and sex offender who's
with a murky job.
Yeah, and like, where's the money even coming from?
Unclear
Yeah,
source
totally.
Of money.
It seems, and so that to me is like the real issue, is that even if there's no fire there, it tells you that in these circles, at least among these particular people who we know about, there was nothing like the kind of reflexive scrutiny that you or I might apply to a figure like Jeffrey Epstein if confronted with him. And
Yeah.
instead, it seems like they basically thought he's one of us. And
Yeah.
whether that means we commit crimes like this too, which I think is unlikely, but whether it just means someone who does these kinds of things is okay, is cool, is, worth spending time with, that's an indictment itself. And I think, very few of those people have adequately answered for that lack of oversight.
We're way over, but I want to ask you one more question, and then I'll just let you cook on it, and then we can take it out. It's kind of a dark topic, which is in your oeuvre. You've been writing a lot about the kind of COVID, post-COVID trauma too, and I was interested in asking you how you think about it in the context of your work about climate, because I think about the COVID stuff, and a million people died in the country over it, and yet when we look back at it, it seems like the cultural remembrance is that like we did too much to guard against it, right? And I just want to even admit, like, I have to fight against that because, like, in my brain, the brain part of me knows that we didn't do enough, right? If a million people died, but there's like a visceral part of me that's like, why was my kid still wearing a mask in fall of 2021 when she probably shouldn't have been, and so I understand why that is. And so I think about that, what we learned from that. And then you compare it to the climate situation where it's like, there's part of you that's like, okay, well, maybe we'd get really more serious about it if New Orleans went underwater or something. But I look at the COVID thing now and I think, I don't know if there's a scale of devastation that would change people's view towards it. So anyway, I wanted to get your take on that thought, and we'll leave it there.
Yeah, in the really big picture, I have much the same view that you do. I actually think in a lot of ways we did overreact on particulars, and there's probably a lot to learn about the things that were unnecessary that we went through. But I think in the really big picture, you have to say that on net, you can't just toss out the whole project of limiting the spread of this disease as wasteless, as useless and wasteful. And the way that I know that for sure is that when I go back to 2020 and I see Anthony Fauci saying 100,000 Americans could die, and everybody's like, what an alarmist.
Right.
That was the public response. It's like that you have Neil Ferguson in England saying maybe a couple million Americans could die, and people are like, that is completely crazy.
Well,
but if that were true, of course we would want to take maximal precautions to protect one another. Then we end up in a world that is actually like the one that the alarmists projected. And we are telling ourselves in that post-pandemic emergency period that it was all unnecessary and that the threat was trivial and that we have been much better off just letting it burn through the population at great speed. And yeah, I think when I compare it to the climate crisis, I think there's something really amazing and inspiring about the first period of the pandemic response, when for a few months, all of us in America and really all of us around the world did an enormous amount to protect one another and ourselves. It was produced by fear, but it was an incredible global gesture of solidarity that I think is basically unparalleled in modern history. And yet we responded to that performance of solidarity by then resenting the fact that we had to do it at all, and resenting it so much. And this is the thing that really frustrates me, resenting it so much that we just don't see clearly what we actually did and the burdens that were actually imposed on us. We talk about lockdowns. First of all, lockdowns were not policed. It was all recommendations. When people talk about Sweden and their voluntary lockdowns, that's what the US did. You can maybe point to a few people who got tickets, like maybe a few dozen people in a country of 330 million people. This was not an authoritarian response. We were given a set of advisories, and in part because we were so scared, we basically respected them for a period of time. How long? A couple of months.
Unless
That's how long. In California, in a couple of other places, things lasted a little bit longer. Certainly the school closures went on much longer than, in retrospect, we would have liked. All of that is absolutely true. But the idea that, in the early months of 2020, you had all of these people on the conspiratorial right saying, like, this is the beginning of a new world government, that they're taking away all of our freedoms. And it was like, I was eating out with friends in the summer of 2020. And I was someone who was scared of the virus, in a place that was run by a pretty aggressive governor, Andrew Cuomo. Can't believe he's back in the news. People were socializing in parks and exercising by the summer of 2020. There were restrictions. You were advised to wear masks. Schools were closed way too long. But when you think about, on the grand scheme of things, like, do we want to go back in time and do absolutely nothing in 2020? Would that have been better? Would it have been better to have, instead of 1.5 million Americans die, 3 or 4 or 5 million Americans die? Like, that is a much, much, much more catastrophic footprint that it would have left. And, I just think if you had put that precise dilemma to the country as a whole in early 2020, they would have said, let's bunker down. It would not have said, let's let it burn. And the fact that we came out of the process thinking that was a mistake, collectively thinking that was a mistake, I think is really sad, problematic. I think it's also a sign of the basic trauma of the whole experience, which is that above all, this thing taught us that however rich we are, however advanced our technology is, however far from the times of the Black Death we really thought we were still biological creatures. We are still vulnerable to forces larger than us, which we cannot perfectly control. And I think, by the way, this is like one reason why Maha really springs up, is because it tells you can control your own health.
Yeah.
When the scary message of the pandemic is you can't really control your own health, certainly on your own. But unfortunately, the social response that we've taken from it was that we're not going to try to do it collectively either. And that really scares me about climate and so much else.
All right. Alan Dershowitz, defender, David Wallace-Wells. Just joking. David Wallace-Wells, New York Times. So subscribe to his newsletter if you want climate stuff. I'm doing my best to keep informed of our bleak future across a separate vertical from the one I cover every day. Appreciate you very much. Come back. Unfortunately, I think we'll probably have reason for you to come back soon. All right.
Cool, man. Talk to you soon.